The sound of a woman's voice drifting across the twilight prairie made Kane Irwin pull hard on his horse's reins, his weathered hand instantly going to the rifle at his side before he recognized the sound as song rather than distress. He had been riding hard for 3 days straight in the summer of 1878, pushing his herd of 200 head from the grazing lands near Bridgeport toward the mining town of Bodie, California, when a sudden thunderstorm 2 nights prior had spooked the cattle into a nervous frenzy that still hadn't fully subsided. The animals were jumpy, their eyes rolling white at every shadow, and Kane knew from 15 years of working cattle that this kind of tension could explode into a stampede at the smallest provocation. Now, as the sun began its descent toward the Sierra Nevada peaks in the distance, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, he heard that voice again, clearer this time, singing an old hymn his mother had once sung to him when fever had nearly taken him as a boy. Kane dismounted slowly, looping his mare's reins around a twisted juniper branch, and moved as quietly as his worn boots would allow across the rocky ground. The voice was coming from just beyond a small rise where a creek cut through the landscape, creating a natural corridor of green in the otherwise dry terrain. As he crested the hill, staying low, he saw her. A woman sat on a flat boulder near the water's edge, her dark hair loose and flowing past her shoulders, catching the golden light. She wore a simple calico dress, faded blue with small white flowers, and her feet were bare, dangling just above the creek's surface. But what truly caught Kane's attention was the scene before her. His entire herd, or at least the leading edge of it, had wandered down into the small valley, drawn by the water and perhaps by something else. The cattle stood in an almost perfect semicircle around the woman, their heads lowered, ears forward, completely transfixed. Their earlier agitation had vanished, replaced by an eerie calm that Kane had rarely seen in livestock. She was singing about green pastures and still waters, her voice rich and clear without being loud, carrying across the distance with a quality that seemed to wrap around everything it touched. Kane found himself standing perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break whatever spell she had cast. The cattle were so settled they had begun to graze, tearing at the grass with steady, rhythmic movements, their tails swishing lazily at flies. The sun continued its descent, and still the woman sang, transitioning from one song to another with barely a pause. She sang ballads Kane had heard in saloons, church hymns, folk songs that must have crossed the ocean from Ireland or Scotland generations ago. Her repertoire seemed endless, and as the minutes stretched into an hour, Kane realized he had forgotten entirely about setting up camp, about checking the herd's condition, about everything except the sound of her voice. The sky had turned from gold to deep purple, the first stars beginning to pierce the darkening canvas above, when she finally stopped singing. The silence that followed felt almost physical, like a blanket settling over the valley. The woman stood, stretching her arms above her head, and began to gather her stockings and boots from where they lay beside the boulder. It was only then that she seemed to notice she had an audience beyond the cattle. Her head turned sharply in Kane's direction, and even in the failing light, he could see her body tense. "I mean no harm, miss," Kane called out quickly, raising both hands to show they were empty. "I have been standing here like a fool for near about 2 hours, listening to you gentle my herd." The woman remained still for a long moment, clearly trying to decide whether to run or stay. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying the same melodic quality he had heard in her singing. "Your herd, these cattle belong to you." "Yes, madam." "Been trying to move them toward Bodie these past days, but they have been nervous as church mice in a cat house since a storm rolled through. Could not get them settled for love nor money. Kane took a cautious step forward, moving into the open where she could see him more clearly. Then I heard you singing, and I found them here, calm as I have ever seen cattle be. What you did, that was something remarkable. She relaxed slightly, sitting back down on the boulder to pull on her stockings and boots. My father used to say I inherited my grandmother's gift with animals. She could walk into a barn full of spooked horses after a lightning strike and have them eating from her hand within minutes. I never believed the stories until I discovered I could do something similar with my voice. Kane moved closer, leading his mare behind him. In the deepening twilight, he could make out more details of the woman's face. She was perhaps 22 or 23, with fine features that spoke of both strength and gentleness. Her eyes were dark, almost black in this light, and they studied him with an intelligence that made him acutely aware of his trail-worn appearance. He was 30 years old, though the sun and wind had carved lines around his eyes that made him look older. 3 days without a proper wash had left him dusty and rough, his dark hair curling over his collar, his jaw covered in stubble. "I am Kane Irwin," he said, removing his hat in a gesture his mother had drilled into him as a boy. "I run cattle between here and Bridgeport, selling to the mines and the towns that spring up around them." "Faye Ellis," she responded, finishing with her boots and standing. "I have been staying at a homestead about 3 miles west of here. The family who owns it, the Grahams, they took me in when I arrived in California 2 months ago. You are not from around here, then?" It was not really a question. Kane could hear the slight accent in her words, something Eastern, refined. "Boston," Faye confirmed. "I came west after my father passed. He was a music professor at the university there, and when he died, there was nothing left to keep me in that city. My mother has been gone since I was a child, and I have no siblings. A friend of my father's had corresponded with the Grahams, mentioned they were looking for someone to help with their children's education. So I sold what little we had and bought a ticket on the Transcontinental Railroad." Kane nodded, understanding the story without her having to elaborate. The West was full of people running from something or towards something, often both at the same time. "The Grahams are good people. Henry Graham sold me beef last year when I was running short before winter." "They have been very kind," Faye agreed. "Though I confess, I sometimes slip away in the evenings to come here and sing. The house is full of noise and activity, which is wonderful, but sometimes I need the quiet." "I interrupted your quiet," Kane said, feeling suddenly awkward. A smile played at the corners of Faye's mouth. "You did, but you also provided an appreciative audience. Most of the time I sing only for the birds and the occasional deer." They stood in an oddly comfortable silence for a moment, the darkness now complete except for the starlight and the thin crescent of a new moon rising in the east. The cattle had spread out across the valley, bedding down for the night in small groups. Kane knew he should ride back to where his 2 hired hands were bringing up the rear of the herd, should set up a proper camp and post watch, but he found himself reluctant to leave this strange, peaceful moment. "Would you allow me to escort you back to the Graham homestead?" he asked finally. "It is full dark now, and there are mountain lions in these hills." Faye considered this, then nodded. "I would appreciate that. I usually return before sunset, but tonight I lost track of time." Kane retrieved his mare and offered to let Faye ride, but she declined, saying the walk was not far and she enjoyed it. They set off westward, following a faint trail that wound between the rocks and scrub brush. For a while, they walked in silence, Kane leading his horse and Faye moving with surprising confidence over the rough ground despite the darkness. "How long have you been working cattle?" Faye asked eventually. "Since I was 15, Kane replied. My father was a rancher in Texas, but he died when I was young. My mother remarried, and my stepfather had no interest in keeping me around once I was old enough to be useful but not old enough to own anything. So I hired on with a cattle drive heading north. Worked my way up from drag rider to trail boss over the years, saved every penny I could. 3 years ago, I bought my first small herd and some grazing rights to land near Bridgeport. Been building it up since then. That must have been difficult, starting with nothing. Everything worth having usually is, Kane said. But I would rather work for myself, even if it means eating beans and hardtack half the year, than make another man rich while I stay poor. Faye laughed, a sound as musical as her singing. My father would have liked you. He had very particular views about the dignity of labor and the importance of independence. He caused quite a scandal at the university once by suggesting that the sons of wealthy families should spend a year working with their hands before being allowed to pursue academic studies. Sounds like a wise man. He was, Faye said softly. Stubborn and idealistic and completely impractical about money, but wise in the ways that mattered. They walked on, and Kane found himself telling her things he rarely shared with anyone. About his childhood in Texas, the way his mother had fought to keep him with her after his father's death, the bitterness of leaving her behind when his stepfather made it clear there was no place for him in the new family. About the years of hard work on other men's ranches, learning every aspect of the cattle business, saving money in a leather pouch he kept hidden in his bedroll. About the moment 3 years ago when he had finally had enough to buy his first 50 head of cattle and felt, for the first time since his father's death, like he was building something that belonged to him. In turn, Faye spoke about Boston, about growing up in a house filled with music but very little money, about her father's passion for teaching that never quite translated into financial stability. She told him about the dark months after her father's consumption had been diagnosed, the way he had wasted away despite her best efforts to care for him, the hollow feeling of watching them lower his coffin into the ground knowing she was truly alone in the world. And then the decision to leave, to come west where everything was new and raw and full of possibility. I thought perhaps I could make a fresh start, she said as the lights of the Graham homestead appeared in the distance. Become someone different, someone less defined by loss. Have you? Kane asked. Faye was quiet for a moment. I do not know yet. I have only been here 2 months, but I feel more alive than I have in a long time. The landscape here, it is so vast and wild. It makes my griefs feel smaller somehow, more manageable. They reached the boundary of the Graham property, marked by a split-rail fence that enclosed several acres of tilled land. The house itself was a substantial structure of wood and stone, with lamplight glowing warmly from its windows. Kane could hear children's voices inside, the sounds of a family settling in for the evening. Thank you for walking with me, Faye said, turning to face him, and for the conversation. I have not spoken so freely with anyone since I arrived here. Kane found himself searching for words, something that would give him an excuse to see her again. My herd will need to rest for a day or two before we push on to Bodie. They have been driven hard, and after that storm, they need time to settle. Would you consider coming back to the valley tomorrow evening? I would pay you, of course, if you could sing to them again. It would make the rest of the drive much easier. Faye tilted her head, studying him in the darkness. You do not need to pay me, Kane Irwin. But I would be happy to come sing for your cattle tomorrow evening, and perhaps you could tell me more about this country, about the places you have been and the things you have seen. I would like that very much, Kane said, meaning it more than he could adequately express. Faye smiled, then turned and walked toward the house, her figure gradually disappearing into the shadows. Kane stood watching until she had safely reached the door and slipped inside. Then he swung up onto his mare and rode back toward his herd, his mind full of dark eyes and a voice that could calm the wildest things. When Kane returned to his camp, he found his two hired hands, Pete and Clarence, sitting by a small fire, eating from tin plates. Pete was older, near 50, with graying hair and a face weathered by decades of outdoor work. Clarence was younger, maybe 25, eager but still learning the subtleties of cattle work. "Boss, where have you been?" Clarence asked, jumping to his feet. "We got the rest of the herd settled about an hour ago, but we could not figure out where the lead cattle had gone." "Found them in a valley about 2 miles east," Kane said, dismounting and loosening his mare's saddle. "They are bedded down there, calm as I have ever seen them." "What settled them?" Pete asked, his eyes sharp. "They have been jumping at shadows for 2 days straight." Kane hesitated, then decided there was no point in being anything but honest. There was a woman there, singing. The cattle just gathered around and listened, and all that nervous energy drained right out of them. Pete and Clarence exchanged glances. "A woman out there alone singing to cattle," Pete said slowly. "Boss, you feeling all right?" "The sun maybe got to you today." "I am fine," Kane said, a bit more sharply than he intended. "Her name is Faye Ellis. She is a teacher staying with the Grahams. She has a gift with animals, uses her voice to calm them. I have never seen anything like it." "The Grahams, over on the west section?" Pete asked, his skepticism fading. "I have heard they took in an Eastern woman to teach their kids. Did not realize she was a cattle whisperer too." "She is coming back tomorrow evening," Kane said, grabbing a plate and spooning beans onto it from the pot hanging over the fire. "I asked her if she would sing to the herd again before we move them on to Bodie." Clarence grinned. "She pretty, this singing woman?" Kane gave him a flat look. "She is a lady, Clarence. Mind your tongue." "That is a yes, then," Pete said, chuckling. "Boss, I have worked for you 3 years now, and I have never seen you look twice at a woman. This must be something special." Kane ate his beans in silence, not trusting himself to respond without revealing more than he wanted to. But Pete was right. He had spent the last 3 years focused entirely on building his herd, on establishing himself as a reliable supplier to the mining towns, on saving money to buy more land. Women had been a distant thought, something to consider once he had achieved stability. Yet after one evening of conversation with Faye Ellis, he found himself thinking about things he had pushed aside for years. The possibility of a home that was more than just a bedroll under the stars. Someone to talk to about more than cattle prices and grazing conditions. A future that included more than just work. He finished his meal and stood, announcing he would take the first watch. Pete tried to protest, saying Kane had been riding all day and should rest, but Kane insisted. The truth was, he needed time alone to think, to process what had happened in that valley. He saddled a fresh horse from his small remuda and rode out to where the cattle were bedded down, making slow circles around the herd. The night was clear and cool, the temperature dropping as it always did in the high desert once the sun set. Stars crowded the sky in impossible numbers, so bright they cast faint shadows on the ground. Kane thought about Faye's face in the fading light, the way she had moved so gracefully over the rough terrain, the intelligence and humor in her voice. He thought about her story, the courage it must have taken to leave everything familiar and travel across a continent to a place she had never seen. Most Eastern women who came west did so with husbands or family, but Faye had come alone, trusting in the kindness of strangers and her own ability to make a new life. That took a kind of strength that Kane recognized and respected. The cattle were indeed calmer than they had been, even those that had not been in the valley to hear Faye sing. Somehow, the peace had transferred through the herd, a collective relaxation that made Kane's job infinitely easier. He knew that a good cattleman understood that livestock were not just dumb animals, that they had their own forms of communication and social structure. Whatever Faye had done, it had worked on a level that went beyond simple distraction. When dawn came, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and orange, Kane rode back to camp to find Pete already up and making coffee. Clarence was still rolled in his blanket, snoring softly. "How was the night?" Pete asked, handing Kane a steaming cup. "Quiet. The cattle barely stirred." Kane sipped the bitter brew gratefully. "I am thinking we will hold here today and tomorrow, let them rest and graze. There is good grass in that valley and the creek has plenty of water. We push on to Bodie the day after tomorrow." "That puts us behind schedule," Pete observed, but without criticism. "The buyer expecting us, he will wait. Better to bring in calm, well-fed cattle than nervous, worn-out animals. We will get a better price that way." Pete nodded, accepting the logic. "You want me to ride ahead to Bodie, let them know we are coming?" "Not yet. We will send Clarence tomorrow if the weather holds." Kane set down his empty cup. "I am going to scout the area, make sure there are no mountain lion dens nearby that might spook the herd." It was a reasonable excuse, and Pete accepted it without question, but Kane knew his real motivation. He wanted to ride over to the Graham homestead, to confirm that Faye would indeed come to the valley that evening, to see her again in daylight. The intensity of his interest in a woman he had known for only a few hours troubled him, but not enough to make him stay away. The Graham homestead looked different in the morning light, bustling with activity. Kane could see Henry Graham working in a field with a plow, 2 young boys following behind him, and a woman he assumed was Graham's wife hanging laundry near the house. He rode up slowly, calling out a greeting to avoid startling anyone. Henry Graham stopped his work and walked over, wiping sweat from his forehead. He was a solid man in his early 40s, with the broad shoulders and calloused hands of someone who had spent his life working the land. "Kane Irwin, is that you? What brings you out this way?" "Morning, Henry. I have got a herd resting in the valley a few miles east, heading to Bodie, but they needed a day or two to recover from a rough few nights." "Rough how?" Henry asked, his farmer's interest piqued. "Storm spooked them. Could not get them settled until last night." Kane hesitated, then continued. "I ran into Miss Ellis by the creek yesterday evening. She was singing, and my cattle just calmed right down. I asked if she would come back tonight, do it again. Wanted to make sure that is all right with you, since she is staying on your property." Henry's weathered face broke into a smile. "Faye told us about that at breakfast this morning. Said she met a cowboy with the most nervous cattle she had ever seen." He laughed. "She is free to go wherever she likes, so long as she is back by dark. My wife worries, though Faye keeps insisting she can take care of herself." "I will make sure she gets back safely," Kane said. "You have my word on that." "I believe you will." Henry studied Kane for a moment. "Faye is a special young woman. Been good for our family, teaching the children not just reading and writing but music and history and all sorts of things my wife and I never learned. We have grown fond of her." Kane heard the protective note in Henry's voice and respected it. "I have no intentions that are not honorable, sir. I just appreciate her helping with my herd." "I am sure you do," Henry said, his tone suggesting he understood more than Kane's words conveyed. "Tell me, how is the cattle business treating you this year?" They spoke for a while about cattle prices and mining town demand, about weather conditions and grazing land, the kind of practical talk that formed the backbone of relationships between men in this country. As they were finishing, Faye emerged from the house, a basket of books in her arms. She wore a different dress today, a simple brown one with a white collar, and her hair was pulled back in a practical bun. When she saw Kane, her face lit up with a smile that made his heart beat faster. "Mr. Irwin," she said, walking over, "I was hoping I might see you today." "I wanted to confirm our arrangement for this evening," Kane said, suddenly aware of Henry Graham's interested gaze. "Make sure you still wanted to come." "I do," Faye said. "I have been looking forward to it. Henry, would it be all right if I finished the children's lessons a bit early today? I promised to help with mending this afternoon, but I would like time to wash up before I go." "Of course," Henry said. "Martha was just saying we rely on you too much as it is. Take whatever time you need." Kane took his leave then, tipping his hat to both of them and riding back toward his camp. He spent the rest of the day doing exactly what he had told Pete he would do, scouting the area around their camp, checking the cattle, making sure everything was in order. But his mind kept drifting to the evening, to the prospect of seeing Faye again, hearing her sing, continuing the conversation they had started. When the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Kane rode to the valley where he had first encountered Faye. The cattle had already started to gather near the creek, instinctively seeking water in the cooler evening hours. He dismounted and settled himself on a slight rise where he could watch both the herd and the trail from the Graham homestead. Faye appeared just as the sun touched the mountains, walking with that same confident stride he remembered from the night before. This time she wore her hair loose, flowing past her shoulders, and she carried a shawl in case the evening turned cold. Kane stood and walked down to meet her. "Your cattle look much better than yesterday," she observed, studying the herd. "They are, thanks to you. I have been moving livestock for 15 years, and I have never seen anything work as well as what you did." Faye set her shawl on the boulder where she had sat the previous evening, then turned to face him. "My grandmother believed that animals respond to intention as much as to sound, that if you truly mean them no harm, if you project calmness and safety, they can sense it. The singing is just a way to focus that intention and make it audible." "Do you believe that?" Kane asked. "I do not know what I believe," Faye admitted, "but I know it works. I have seen it work with cattle, horses, even a bear once when I was young and foolish enough to go wandering in the woods alone." "A bear?" she laughed. "I was 12 and thought I knew everything. I surprised a mother with cubs and she stood up and roared at me. I was terrified, but something made me start singing instead of running. An old lullaby my grandmother had taught me. The bear dropped back to all fours and just watched me while I backed away slowly, still singing. My father was furious when I got home and told him. He forbade me from going into the woods alone after that." Kane found himself captivated not just by the story but by the way she told it, the expressions that crossed her face, the gestures of her hands. "You must have been quite a handful as a child." "I was," Faye agreed. "My father always said I had my mother's adventurous spirit. She died giving birth to what would have been my brother when I was 5, so I do not remember her well. But my father kept her memory alive through stories." The light was fading quickly now, and Faye settled herself on the boulder, letting her feet dangle toward the water. The cattle had indeed begun to gather, responding to her presence even before she started to sing. Kane found his spot on the rise where he had waited earlier, close enough to hear clearly but far enough away to give her space to work whatever magic she possessed. She began with a song he did not recognize, something slow and haunting in a language that might have been Gaelic. The cattle moved closer, arranging themselves in that same semicircle he had seen the night before. Then she shifted to a livelier tune, a folk song about a sailor and a mermaid that made Kane smile despite himself. She sang for over an hour, her voice rising and falling with the natural rhythms of the landscape around them, and Kane sat transfixed, watching the last light drain from the sky and the stars emerge one by one above them. When she finally stopped, the silence felt profound. The cattle had settled completely, many of them lying down, chewing their cud in contentment. Faye stood and stretched, then walked over to where Kane sat. "May I join you?" she asked. "Please do." She settled beside him on the rocky ground, pulling her shawl around her shoulders against the cooling air. For a while they simply sat together, looking at the stars. "Tell me about Bodie," Faye said eventually. "I have heard it is quite a rough place." "It is," Kane confirmed. "A mining town, full of men looking to strike it rich or spend the gold they have already found. There are dozens of saloons, gambling halls, dance halls. Fights break out most nights. The cemetery is called Boot Hill because so many residents end up there with their boots on, if you understand my meaning. It sounds dangerous. It can be, if you are looking for trouble or if trouble is looking for you. But there is money there, and where there is money, there is demand for beef. I can get twice the price in Bodie that I could in Bridgeport or Bishop." "Is that why you do this?" Faye asked. "For the money?" Kane considered the question. "Partly. I would be lying if I said otherwise. But it is also about building something, about having land and livestock that belong to me. When I was young and working for other men, I swore that one day I would work for myself. Every cow I sell, every dollar I save, that is another step toward that goal. What will you do when you reach it?" "When you have enough land and cattle, I suppose I will set new goals," Kane said. "Maybe build a proper house instead of living in a line shack half the year. Maybe run for town council, have a say in how things are done. Maybe start a family if I find someone willing to put up with a cattle rancher." He had not meant to say that last part, and he felt heat rise in his face despite the cool evening air. Faye was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "I think any woman would be lucky to share a life with someone as determined and honest as you are, Kane Irwin." Kane turned to look at her, and in the starlight he could see she was already watching him. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and something that felt like recognition. He wanted to kiss her, wanted it with an intensity that startled him, but he held back, aware that rushing would risk something precious before it had a chance to fully form. "Would you tell me more about Boston?" he asked instead. "About your life there." So she did, painting pictures with her words of a city he had never seen, full of brick buildings and cobblestone streets, universities and concert halls, immigrants from every corner of the world. She told him about her father's small apartment near the university, about the students who would come for lessons and sometimes stay for dinner, about winter snows that buried the city and spring rains that turned the streets to mud. In turn, Kane told her about cattle drives through Texas, about swimming herds across swollen rivers, about nights spent under stars exactly like these with 2,000 head of cattle and a dozen men between him and disaster. He told her about arriving in California, about seeing the Sierra Nevada for the first time and feeling like he had found the place he was meant to be. They talked until the moon had climbed high in the sky and the night had grown cold enough that Faye was shivering despite her shawl. Kane insisted on escorting her back to the Graham homestead again, and this time when they walked, he offered his arm and she took it, her hand resting lightly in the crook of his elbow. The contact, innocent as it was, sent warmth spreading through his chest. At the Graham fence, Faye turned to him. "Will you be moving your herd tomorrow?" "The day after," Kane said. "One more day of rest for them. Then I will come again tomorrow evening if you would like." "I would like that very much." Faye reached out and touched his hand briefly, a gesture that conveyed more than words could. Then she turned and walked toward the house, and Kane watched her go, already counting the hours until he would see her again. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Kane worked alongside Pete and Clarence, checking the cattle, repairing tack, doing all the small maintenance tasks that filled a cattleman's life. But his mind kept drifting to the evening, to Faye, to the feeling of her hand on his arm. Pete noticed his distraction and said nothing, but Kane caught the older man watching him with a knowing smile more than once. When evening finally came, Kane rode to the valley to find Faye already there, sitting on her boulder with her feet in the water. She had brought a small basket with her this time, and when he approached, she smiled and opened it to reveal fresh bread, cheese, and apples. "Martha Graham insisted I bring enough for two," she said. "I think she suspects I am not coming out here just to sing to cattle." Kane laughed and dismounted, accepting the food gratefully. They ate together as the sun set, talking about everything and nothing, falling into the easy rhythm of conversation they had established. Then Faye sang again, and Kane watched the cattle settle, watched her face in the fading light, and felt something shift inside him, some final wall coming down. When she finished singing and came to sit beside him, Kane found the courage to say what he had been thinking all day. "Faye, I know we have only known each other 2 days. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I need you to know that I have not felt this way about anyone in my life. The thought of driving my herd to Bodie and then moving on without seeing you again, it feels wrong somehow." Faye was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "I have been thinking the same thing," she said finally. "When I came west, I told myself I was looking for a fresh start, a new life. But I think what I was really looking for was a reason to care again, a reason to invest myself in something beyond just surviving each day. And then I met you, and suddenly I found myself thinking about futures and possibilities I had stopped allowing myself to imagine." "What kind of futures?" Kane asked, his heart hammering in his chest. "Ones where I am not alone," Faye said softly. "Where I have someone to talk to about more than lesson plans and household tasks. Someone who understands what it means to build something from nothing. Someone who looks at me the way you do, like I am not just a teacher or a charity case but a woman worth knowing." Kane reached out and took her hand, marveling at how small it felt in his calloused palm. "You are worth knowing, Faye Ellis. You are worth a great deal more than that." She turned her hand in his, lacing their fingers together. "What do we do about this, Kane? You have a herd to move, a business to run. I have obligations to the Grahams. We cannot just run off together like characters in one of my father's romantic novels." "No," Kane agreed. "But we can be honest about what we feel, and we can figure out a way to see each other again after I finish my business in Bodie. It is only 2 days' ride from here. I could come back, court you properly if the Grahams agree to it." "Henry and Martha would agree," Faye said with certainty. "They have been wonderful to me, but I think they would be happy to see me settled with someone. They worry about me being alone." "Then that is what we will do," Kane said. "I will deliver my herd, collect my payment, and come back. Maybe take a few days before I head back to Bridgeport. We can spend time together, figure out if this thing between us is as real as it feels right now." Faye lifted his hand to her cheek, holding it there for a moment. The gesture was so tender, so full of trust, that Kane felt his breath catch. "It feels very real to me," she whispered. "To me as well," Kane said. They sat together in the darkness, hands intertwined, until Faye reluctantly said she needed to return before the Grahams started to worry. Kane walked her back as he had the previous nights, but this time when they reached the fence, he turned to face her fully. "May I write to you?" he asked. "When I am back in Bridgeport, may I send letters?" "I would be disappointed if you did not," Faye said, smiling. "I am told I write a decent letter myself." I have no doubt of that. Kane hesitated, then added, Faye, I want to kiss you. But I also want to do this right, to give you no cause to doubt my intentions or my respect for you. I do not doubt either of those things, Faye said. She stepped closer, rising on her toes, and kissed his cheek softly. But I appreciate that you asked. It speaks to the kind of man you are. Kane touched the spot where her lips had been, feeling like a boy of 15 instead of a man of 30. I will see you one more time before I leave, he said. Tomorrow evening before we move the herd at dawn the next day. I will be here, Faye promised. Kane rode back to camp that night feeling like the world had shifted on its axis. Everything looked the same, the stars and the mountains and the distant glow of campfires, but somehow everything had changed. He had come west to build a cattle business, to establish himself as his own man, and he had succeeded in that. But now he realized that success felt hollow without someone to share it with, without someone who understood not just what he did, but why he did it. Pete was waiting by the fire when Kane returned, and one look at Kane's face made the older man chuckle. Boss, I have known you 3 years, and I have never seen you smile like that. This singing woman must be something special indeed. She is, Kane said simply. Pete, how long have you been married? 28 years come October. Why? What made you know your wife was the one? How did you decide? Pete poked at the fire with a stick, considering. Well, I met my Sarah when we were both young, maybe 18 or 19. She was working in a hotel in Abilene, and I was just another cowboy passing through. But there was something about her, the way she looked at me like she saw past all the trail dust and bravado to the man underneath. We talked for about 10 minutes that first time, and I knew. Just knew, deep in my bones, that I wanted to spend my life with that woman. Took me 2 more years to save up enough money to feel like I could offer her a decent life, and when I finally went back to ask her, I was terrified she would have married someone else or forgotten all about me. But she was still there, still waiting, and she said yes before I even finished getting the question out. Do you ever regret it? The settling down, the responsibility? Not once, Pete said firmly. Sarah has followed me all over this country, lived in lined shacks and sod houses and one-room cabins, raised our kids in places where the nearest town was a day's ride away. She never complained, never asked for more than I could give. Having her beside me, that made every hard year worth it. And now that the kids are grown and we have our own small place, I look at her across the dinner table and still feel like the luckiest man alive. Kane stared into the fire, absorbing this. I have only known Faye for 3 days. Sometimes 3 days is enough, Pete said. Sometimes you just know. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Court her properly. Make sure this is not just some passing fancy brought on by loneliness and starlight. That is the smart approach, Pete agreed. But boss, if you are sure, if you really know, do not wait too long. Life is short and unpredictable, especially out here. Do not let fear or caution rob you of happiness. Kane nodded, taking the advice to heart. He rolled into his blanket that night thinking about Faye's face in the starlight, about the feel of her hand in his, about the possibility of a future that included more than just cattle and hard work. The next day passed in a flurry of preparation for the drive to Bodie. Kane and his men checked the cattle one final time, repaired any gear that had taken damage during the storm, and packed up the camp. Kane rode over to the Graham homestead mid-morning to thank Henry and Martha personally for allowing Faye to help with his herd. Martha Graham was a sturdy woman in her late 30s, with kind eyes and work-worn hands. She invited Kane in for coffee and cornbread, and they sat at the family's kitchen table making small talk about weather and cattle prices. Finally, Martha set down her cup and looked at Kane directly. Mr. Irwin, my husband tells me you have taken an interest in Faye. Kane met her gaze steadily. Yes, madam, I have. She is a remarkable woman. She is, Martha agreed. She is also far from home, without family or protection. Henry and I have grown very fond of her these past months, almost like she is one of our own. So I am going to speak plainly. What are your intentions? To court her properly, if she will have me and if you and Henry approve. I am not a rich man, Mrs. Graham, but I am an honest one. I have my own herd, my own land rights, and I have been building my business steadily for 3 years now. I can provide for a wife, maybe not in luxury, but comfortably enough. Martha studied him for a long moment. Faye has told us a bit about your conversations. She says you are kind and hard-working, that you understand loss and loneliness. Those are not small things, but the life of a cattleman's wife is not easy. Long months alone while you are out with the herd, living in remote places, making do with little. Are you certain that is what you want for her? I want whatever Faye wants, Kane said honestly. If she decides ranch life is not for her, then we will figure something else out. But I will not make promises I cannot keep, and I will not ask her to be someone she is not. All I can offer is my best effort to build a good life for both of us. Martha's stern expression softened into a smile. That is a good answer, Mr. Irwin. Henry and I will give our blessing to your courtship, but if you hurt that girl, you will answer to me. Are we clear? Yes, madam, Kane said, managing not to smile at the thought of this mother of 4 coming after him. Completely clear. He left the Graham homestead feeling like he had passed some crucial test. When evening came and he rode to the valley one final time, he found Faye waiting as promised. This time she did not sit on the boulder but stood at the water's edge, and when she saw him, she walked directly to meet him. Martha spoke to you this morning, she said. It was not a question. She did. She wanted to know my intentions. And what did you tell her? The truth. That I want to court you properly, to see if what we feel right now can grow into something lasting. Faye reached out and took both his hands in hers. Kane, I need to tell you something. I have not been completely honest with you. Kane felt his stomach drop. What do you mean? When I told you I came west for a fresh start, that was true. But there was more to it than just my father's death. In Boston, there was a man, someone my father wanted me to marry. He was a fellow professor, older, established, financially secure. After my father died, this man proposed and he expected me to accept. He saw it as a practical arrangement, a way to take care of the poor orphaned daughter of his colleague. He did not love me, and I certainly did not love him. But the alternative was facing complete poverty, losing the apartment, having nothing. So you ran, Kane said, understanding dawning. I ran, Faye confirmed. I used the last of the money from selling my father's books to buy a train ticket, and I wrote to the Grahams accepting their offer before I could talk myself out of it. The man I was supposed to marry, he wrote me several angry letters that followed me here. He felt humiliated, I think, that I chose poverty in California over security with him. The last letter arrived 2 weeks ago, saying he was coming west to bring me back, to make me see reason. Kane felt anger rise in his chest. Has he come? Not yet. Maybe he never will. Maybe it was an empty threat. But I needed you to know, needed you to understand that if we pursue this, there might be complications. Kane stepped closer, releasing one of her hands so he could lift the other to his lips. Faye, I have dealt with stampedes and lightning strikes and mountain lions. I think I can handle one angry professor from Boston, but I appreciate you telling me. Is there anything else I should know? No, Faye said, and he could hear the relief in her voice. I just did not want there to be secrets between us. There will not be, Kane promised. Now, will you sing one more time for my cattle, and for me? Faye smiled and walked to her boulder, settling herself as she had the previous evenings. Kane found his usual spot on the rise, and as the sun began its final descent, Faye's voice rose into the cooling air. She sang all the songs he had come to know over the past few days, and then, as the last light faded from the sky, she sang something new. It was a love song, old and beautiful, about two souls finding each other across distance and time. Kane listened with tears burning behind his eyes, understanding that she was singing it for him, that this was her way of saying what neither of them had quite managed to put into words yet. When she finished and came to join him, Kane stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her close. She fit against him perfectly, her head tucked under his chin, her arms wrapped around his waist. They stood like that for a long time, not speaking, just being together. Finally, Faye pulled back enough to look up at him. "Come back to me, Kane Irwin. Sell your cattle in Bodie and come back." "I will," Kane promised. "Count on it." This time, when he walked her back to the Graham homestead, he did kiss her. A gentle press of lips that was more promise than passion, but no less meaningful for its restraint. Faye kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, and when they parted, she whispered, "I will be waiting." Kane rode back to camp that night with her taste on his lips and her image burned into his mind. Pete and Clarence had everything ready for an early departure, and Kane forced himself to focus on the work ahead. They would push the herd hard tomorrow, trying to reach Bodie by nightfall. It was a day's drive under good conditions, and Kane was counting on the cattle staying calm after Faye's gentle influence. They set out before dawn, moving the herd east toward the mining town. The cattle moved well, still carrying that unusual calmness that Faye's singing had instilled. They made good time across the high desert, following trails that wound between the mountains. Kane found himself thinking about Faye constantly, about the life they might build together if everything went as he hoped. He imagined building a house on his grazing land near Bridgeport, something solid with real walls and windows that let in light. He imagined Faye singing in that house, filling it with music and warmth. He imagined children, a family, all the things he had pushed aside as impractical dreams while he focused on survival and business. They reached Bodie just as the sun was setting, driving the herd into the holding pens on the outskirts of town. Kane had sent word ahead, and his buyer was waiting, a mine supply merchant named Gibson who always paid fair prices and on time. They negotiated briefly, settling on a figure that was higher than Kane had hoped for, and Gibson promised to have the payment ready the next morning after he had counted and inspected the cattle properly. Bodie at night was exactly as rough as its reputation suggested. The main street was lined with saloons and gambling halls, all blazing with light and noise. Men stumbled from one establishment to the next, already drunk despite the early hour. Gunshots rang out somewhere in the distance, and Kane saw a fight break out outside one saloon, men rolling in the dust while onlookers cheered and placed bets. Kane, Pete, and Clarence found a boarding house at the quieter end of town and paid for rooms and baths. The hot water felt like heaven after days on the trail, and Kane luxuriated in scrubbing away the accumulated dirt and sweat. He put on his cleanest shirt and headed to a restaurant Pete recommended, one that served actual food rather than just whiskey and cards. Over steak and potatoes, the three men discussed plans. Pete would head back to Bridgeport with Clarence, begin preparing for the next drive. Kane would stay in Bodie for a few days to handle some business, then ride back toward the Graham homestead. "You are going to ask her, are not you?" Pete said, cutting into his steak. "Ask her to marry you." Kane had not quite admitted it to himself yet, but hearing Pete say it made him realize it was true. "I am thinking about it. Is that crazy? We have known each other less than a week." "I told you my story," Pete said. "Sometimes you just know. And boss, you are not getting any younger. You have built yourself a solid business, but what is it all for if you spend your life alone?" "I agree with Pete," Clarence chimed in. "And Miss Ellis, she is pretty and she can sing like an angel. You could do a lot worse." Kane laughed, but he was thinking seriously about what they were saying. He had money saved, enough to buy a ring in one of Bodie's surprisingly well-stocked jewelry stores. He had a business that was growing, land he could build on. What he did not have was time. The cattle business required him to be on the move for much of the year. If he wanted to build a life with Faye, he needed to make his intentions clear, before circumstances pulled them apart. The next morning, Kane collected his payment from Gibson, counting the bills twice to make sure everything was correct. It was a substantial sum, representing months of work and careful husbandry. He deposited most of it with the local Wells Fargo agent, keeping only what he would need for the next few months. Then he walked down Bodie's Main Street, past the saloons and brothels and gambling halls, to a shop with a wooden sign that read "Fine Goods and Jewelry." The proprietor was a small man with wire-rimmed spectacles and an accent that suggested he had come from somewhere in Europe. He showed Kane several rings, but none of them felt right until he brought out a simple gold band with a small diamond, nothing ostentatious but clearly well-crafted. "This comes from a lady whose husband struck gold and bought her a more expensive ring," the jeweler explained. "She sold this one to me last month. It is quality work and the price is reasonable." Kane held the ring up to the light, imagining it on Faye's finger. It was delicate but sturdy, much like Faye herself. "I will take it," he said. He spent the rest of the day making other purchases. Fabric he thought Faye might like, some books from the general store, a letter tablet, and good ink. Then, despite Pete's protestations that he should rest at least one more day, Kane saddled his horse and set out back toward the Graham homestead. The ride that had taken a full day with the herd took Kane less than 8 hours on horseback, pushing his mare harder than he probably should have. He reached the Graham property just after sunset, his horse lathered and breathing hard. Henry Graham was sitting on his porch smoking a pipe, and he stood when he saw Kane ride up. "Mr. Irwin, I was not expecting you back so soon." "I finished my business quicker than anticipated," Kane said, dismounting. "I was hoping I might see Miss Ellis." Henry studied him for a moment, then called toward the house. "Faye, you have a visitor." Faye appeared in the doorway, backlit by lamplight, and Kane saw her expression transform from curiosity to joy when she recognized him. She rushed down the porch steps, and Kane caught her in his arms, spinning her around. When he set her down, they were both laughing. "You came back," she said, slightly breathless. "I told you I would." Henry cleared his throat. "Why do not you two take a walk? It is a pleasant evening." They walked away from the house, following a path that led toward a small orchard behind the main buildings. Once they were out of sight, Faye turned to Kane, her expression serious. "You were only gone 2 days. What happened?" Kane reached into his pocket, feeling the small box there. "I realized something while I was in Bodie. I realized that I have spent the last 3 years working toward a goal, building a business, saving money. But I never thought about why, never thought about what I would do once I achieved what I set out to do. Then I met you, and suddenly everything became clear. The business, the money, the land, it is all just means to an end. What I really want is a life with meaning, with someone to share it with." "Kane," Faye said softly, and he could hear the emotion in her voice. "I know we have not known each other long," Kane continued. "I know this is fast, maybe too fast. But I also know how I feel, and I know that if I do not ask you now, I might lose my courage. Or worse, circumstances might pull us apart before I get another chance." He pulled out the box and opened it, revealing the ring. In the fading light, the small diamond caught and reflected the last rays of the sun. "Faye Ellis, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Faye stared at the ring, tears streaming down her face. For a long, terrible moment she did not speak, and Kane felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Then she looked up at him, smiling through her tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you, Kane Irwin." Kane let out a breath he had not realized he was holding and slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been made for her. Then he pulled her close and kissed her properly this time. Not the gentle promise of their first kiss, but something deeper and more passionate, full of all the longing and hope he had been carrying. Faye kissed him back with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "I cannot believe this is happening," Faye whispered, looking at the ring on her finger. "4 days ago, I was just a teacher, alone in a new place, trying to figure out what to do with my life. And now you are engaged to a cattle rancher who probably should have courted you properly for at least a few months before proposing," Kane said, laughing. "I do not care about proper courtship," Faye said firmly. "I care about honesty and intention, and you have given me both. Besides, I think we have done more real talking in the past few days than most couples manage in months of formal courtship." They walked back to the house hand in hand, and when Henry and Martha saw the ring on Faye's finger, Martha let out a delighted squeal and pulled Faye into a tight embrace. "I knew it," she said. "From the first morning when you came back from singing to those cattle, I knew something had changed." Henry shook Kane's hand with a grip that conveyed both congratulations and warning. "You take care of her, you hear me?" "I will," Kane promised, "with everything I have." They spent the evening making plans. Kane wanted to marry as soon as possible, within the next few weeks if a preacher could be found. Faye agreed, seeing no reason to wait when they were both certain of their feelings. Martha immediately began talking about what Faye would need for a wedding, making lists in her head of fabric and food and guests. The Graham children, all 4 of them, were thrilled at the prospect of a wedding, the younger ones asking a barrage of questions about where Faye and Kane would live, and could they visit, and would there be cake. Kane stayed for dinner, a raucous affair with the whole Graham family crowded around their table, and he felt more at home than he had in years. This, he realized, was what he had been missing. Not just Faye, though she was at the center of it, but the sense of belonging to something larger than himself, of being part of a family. After dinner, Kane and Faye sat on the porch while Henry and Martha got the children ready for bed. They held hands and talked about logistics, about where they would live and how they would manage the cattle business. "I have a line shack on my grazing land near Bridgeport," Kane explained. "It is not much, just 1 room with a stove and a bed and a table. But the land around it is beautiful, and there is a good spot for building a proper house. I have been saving money for that, but I wanted to wait until I could afford to do it right." "How long would it take to build a house?" Faye asked. "If I hire help, maybe 3 months. But that would use up most of my savings, and I need to keep enough back for buying more cattle next spring." "Then we will live in the line shack for now," Faye said decisively. "I do not need a grand house, Kane. I just need you. We can build the house together when we can afford it, make it exactly what we want." Kane looked at her with something close to awe. "You are sure? It is rough living, Faye. Cold in winter, hot in summer, no neighbors for miles." "I am sure," Faye said. "I did not come west looking for comfort. I came looking for a life with meaning, and I have found it. They made arrangements for the wedding. There was a circuit preacher who came through the area once a month, and Henry agreed to send word that his services would be needed. In the meantime, Kane would ride back to Bridgeport to settle his affairs there and prepare the line shack for Faye's arrival. They decided on a date 3 weeks away, which would give Faye time to prepare and Kane time to make sure everything was ready. The night before Kane left, he and Faye walked out to the valley where they had first met. The moon was full, casting silver light across the landscape. The creek murmured softly, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. "Will you sing for me?" Kane asked. "One more time before I go." Faye smiled and settled on her boulder, and her voice rose into the night air, clear and pure. She sang the love song she had sung that last evening before Kane took his herd to Bodie, and then she sang others, weaving together a tapestry of sound that seemed to hold all the joy and promise of what lay ahead for them. When she finished, Kane held out his hand, and she came to him. They stood together in the moonlight, wrapped in each other's arms, and Kane thought about how much his life had changed in a single week. He had come to this valley with a nervous herd and no thought beyond getting them safely to market. He was leaving engaged to a woman who had somehow seen past all his rough edges to the man he wanted to be. 3 weeks, Faye said, echoing his thoughts, "and then we start our life together." 3 weeks, Kane agreed. "I will be counting every minute." He kissed her goodbye the next morning, holding her close for a long moment, before forcing himself to mount his horse and ride away. He looked back once and saw her standing in the yard, one hand raised in farewell, and had to resist the urge to turn around and ride back to her. The 3 weeks that followed were the longest of Kane's life. He threw himself into work, repairing the line shack, replacing the roof, adding a proper door with a lock, building shelves for storage. He bought supplies in Bridgeport, flour and coffee and sugar, beans and salt pork, everything they would need to get through the first few months. He bought fabric and thread, dishes and pots, a new quilt for the bed. Pete came to help, and together they whitewashed the cabin's interior, making it bright and clean. "This is a far cry from the bachelor hovel it was a month ago," Pete observed, standing back to admire their work. "I want it to be nice for her," Kane said. "I want her to feel like she has a real home. Boss, that woman is not marrying you for your house. She is marrying you because you are a good man who treats her with respect and loves her like she deserves to be loved. But I am proud of you for putting in the effort anyway." Kane also rode to Bridgeport to arrange for a proper marriage license, and to buy Faye a wedding gift. He found a beautiful shawl, woven with intricate patterns in blues and greens, and a music box that played a melody he thought she would like. He bought himself new clothes too, wanting to look presentable for his wedding. Letters arrived from Faye every few days, carried by the male rider who passed between the settlements. Her handwriting was beautiful, flowing and elegant, and her words were full of excitement and plans and occasional moments of doubt that Kane hastened to address in his replies. She told him about helping Martha Graham sew her wedding dress, about teaching the Graham children extra lessons so they would be prepared for whoever came next, about her mixed feelings of excitement and sadness at leaving the family that had become her first true home in California. Kane wrote back about the work he was doing on the cabin, about his nervousness and his certainty all tangled together, about how he lay awake at night imagining their life together. He told her about Pete's advice and the music box he had bought and the mountains that would surround their home. He poured his heart into those letters in a way he had never done in spoken conversation, and Faye's responses suggested she was doing the same. Finally, the day arrived. Kane rode to the Graham homestead with Pete accompanying him, both of them dressed in their best clothes. The circuit preacher had arrived the day before, a kindly man named Reverend Thomas, who had been marrying couples and burying the dead across California for 20 years. The Grahams had invited neighbors from miles around, and the yard was full of people Kane barely knew but who had come to celebrate nonetheless. Then, Faye appeared on the porch, and Kane forgot how to breathe. She wore a dress of pale blue, simple but beautifully made, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Her dark hair was pulled back but left loose to flow down her back, and she wore a crown of wildflowers that the Graham children had clearly helped gather. She was the most beautiful thing Kane had ever seen. The ceremony itself was brief, conducted under a big oak tree in the Graham yard. Kane stood with his heart pounding while Reverend Thomas spoke about love and commitment and the sanctity of marriage. He made his vows in a voice that shook slightly, promising to love and honor and protect Faye for as long as he lived. Faye made her vows in return, her voice clear and steady, her eyes locked on his. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them man and wife and told Kane he could kiss his bride, Kane pulled Faye into his arms and kissed her with all the longing and joy of the past 3 weeks pouring through him. The gathered crowd cheered and clapped, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were grinning like fools. The celebration that followed was warm and joyful. Martha had prepared an enormous feast, and neighbors had brought dishes as well, covering long tables with more food than Kane had seen in one place outside of a hotel dining room. There was music too, several men with fiddles and guitars, and dancing in the yard as the sun began to set. Faye sang, of course, her wedding gift to the gathered community, and her voice brought tears to many eyes. As the evening wore on and the stars began to appear, Kane and Faye slipped away. They had a wagon loaded with Faye's possessions and the supplies Kane had brought, and they would make the journey to Bridgeport that night, camping along the way. Pete had offered to drive the wagon, giving them privacy, following at a discreet distance. They made camp in a sheltered spot Kane knew, where a hot spring created a warm pool surrounded by rocks. Kane had brought a tent, and he set it up while Faye unpacked a few essentials. Pete made himself scarce, saying he would camp on the other side of the hot spring, and they should not expect to see him until morning. Inside the tent, by the light of a single lantern, Kane and Faye finally came together as husband and wife. Kane was gentle and patient, acutely aware that this was new for Faye, wanting her first experience to be full of tenderness rather than urgency. Faye responded with a mixture of nervousness and growing passion, trusting him completely, and when they finally joined together fully, it felt like something profound and sacred, a bond that went deeper than just physical pleasure. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the blankets, listening to the night sounds outside the tent. Faye rested her head on Kane's chest, tracing idle patterns on his skin with her fingers. "Are you happy?" Kane asked softly. "Happier than I thought possible," Faye replied. "When I left Boston, I was just running away from something I did not want. But somewhere along the way, I found what I did want. I found you." Kane kissed the top of her head. "I am the one who got lucky. You walked into my life singing to my cattle and you changed everything." They reached the line shack the next afternoon, and Kane watched nervously as Faye took in her new home. It was indeed small, just one room with a stove in the corner, a bed against one wall, a table and chairs in the center, and the new shelves Kane had built. But it was clean and bright, and through the single window there was a view of mountains that took Faye's breath away. "It is perfect," she said, turning to him with shining eyes. "Kane, it is absolutely perfect." They settled into married life with surprising ease. Faye took charge of the domestic sphere, cooking meals that were vastly better than anything Kane had managed on his own, keeping the cabin clean and organized. But she also insisted on learning about the cattle business, riding out with Kane to check the herd, learning to recognize signs of illness or distress in the animals, understanding the economics of buying and selling. Kane discovered that being married to Faye meant always having someone to talk to, someone who listened with genuine interest when he spoke about his work and offered thoughtful opinions. It meant coming back to the cabin after a long day to find it warm and welcoming, full of the smells of cooking and the sound of singing. It meant waking up beside someone whose face was the first thing he saw each morning and the last thing at night. They also discovered the challenges of living in such isolation. Winter came early that year, with snow blanketing the mountains by November. The cabin was snug enough, but they were cut off from other settlements for weeks at a time, dependent entirely on their stores of food and fuel. Faye struggled with the loneliness at first, missing the bustle of the Graham household and the structure of teaching. But she adapted, finding ways to keep herself occupied, reading the books Kane had bought her, writing letters that would be sent when the weather cleared, and always singing. Kane sometimes came back from checking the herd in the middle of the day to find Faye standing outside the cabin despite the cold, singing to the mountains as if they were her audience. The cattle responded to her voice just as they had that first evening, staying calm even when wolves prowled nearby or storms threatened. Spring came, and with it, new challenges and joys. Faye announced she was pregnant in March, just as the snow was beginning to melt. Kane was terrified and elated in equal measure, suddenly acutely aware of how far they were from a doctor or midwife. Faye, however, was calm. "Women have been having babies for thousands of years," she said when Kane expressed his concerns. "We will be fine." Kane rode to Bridgeport and arranged for a midwife to come stay with them as Faye's time approached. He also began building the house he had promised her, working furiously through the spring and summer to get it finished before the baby came. Pete came to help, and several neighbors who had attended their wedding offered their labor as well, raising walls and a roof in a style called barn raising that turned the work into a community event. The house was simple but solid, with 2 rooms downstairs and a loft above that could be divided into bedrooms later. It had real glass windows that Kane had freighted in at considerable expense, and a stone fireplace that would keep them warm through the winter. Faye cried when she saw it finished, overwhelmed by the effort Kane and the community had put into making it a home. Their son was born in October, during an early snowstorm that trapped the midwife with them for 3 days. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Kane feared he would lose both Faye and the baby. But Faye was stronger than she looked, and she brought their son into the world with a final fierce push and a cry of triumph. When the midwife placed the squalling infant in Kane's arms, he felt something break open inside him, a rush of love so intense it was almost painful. They named him James, after Kane's father, and called him Jamie. He had Faye's dark eyes and Kane's strong features, and from the beginning, he was loud and demanding and perfect. Faye recovered slowly from the birth, and Kane took over most of the household tasks for the first few weeks, learning to change diapers and swaddle a baby while Faye rested and regained her strength. The first year of Jamie's life was exhausting and wonderful. Kane had never known it was possible to be so tired and so happy at the same time. He watched Faye transform into a mother, singing to Jamie the same songs she had once sung to cattle, and finding that they worked just as well on fussy infants. He discovered reserves of patience he had not known he possessed, walking the floor at 3 in the morning with a crying baby while Faye snatched a few precious hours of sleep. The cattle business continued to grow. Kane hired more hands, including a young man named Thomas who proved reliable and hard-working. This allowed Kane to spend more time at home, to be present for Jamie's first smile, first tooth, first word. He still made the drives to Bodie and other mining towns, but now he always hurried back, eager to return to his family. When Jamie was 2, Faye announced she was pregnant again. Their daughter was born the following spring, an easier birth than Jamie's had been. They named her Rose, and she was smaller and quieter than her brother but no less demanding. Kane now had a house full of noise and life, and he loved every chaotic minute of it. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and cattle drives, of children growing and the business expanding. Kane bought more land, built a proper barn, hired more hands. Faye started teaching again, taking on the children of neighboring ranchers and farmers, using one room of their house as a schoolroom. She sang to the children as she had once sung to cattle, and they learned their letters and numbers to the accompaniment of folk songs and hymns. Jamie grew into a sturdy boy who loved horses and wanted to be a cowboy like his father. Rose was quieter, more thoughtful, with a gift for music that rivaled her mother's. Kane taught them both to ride, to understand cattle, to respect the land and the animals that depended on it. Faye taught them to read and write, to appreciate beauty and art, to think critically about the world around them. On their 5th anniversary, Kane took Faye back to the valley where they had first met. The cattle were long gone, sold and replaced many times over, but the creek still murmured over the rocks, and the mountains still rose majestically in the distance. They sat on the boulder where Faye had once sung to his nervous herd, and she sang for him again, her voice a little deeper now, enriched by the years and the experiences they had shared. "You ever regret it?" Kane asked when she finished. "Giving up your plans to teach in town, tying yourself to a cattle rancher in this remote place?" Faye took his hand, lacing their fingers together as she had that first night. "Not once. This life, it is harder than anything I imagined in Boston, but it is also richer, more meaningful. I have you and our children, this community we have built. I have a purpose beyond just surviving each day. No, Kane, I have never regretted choosing you." Kane pulled her close, kissing her with the same passion he had felt on their wedding day. "I love you, Faye Irwin. More than I knew it was possible to love another person." "And I love you," Faye said. "You and the life we have built together." As they sat there, watching the sun set over the valley that had brought them together, Kane thought about the improbable chain of events that had led to this moment. A storm spooked his herd. A woman sang in the twilight. He listened until the sun went down. And from that brief encounter had grown something neither of them could have anticipated. A love that sustained them through hardship and joy, through the everyday challenges of building a life in rough country, through the profound transformations that came with becoming parents and partners in every sense of the word. The years continued to unfold with their own particular texture. When Jamie was 8 and Rose was 6, Faye gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named David and Samuel. The house that had once seemed so spacious suddenly felt cramped, and Kane began planning an addition, more bedrooms to accommodate their growing family. The cattle business was thriving now, with Kane supplying beef not just to Bodie, but to several other mining towns, and even some of the larger ranches that did not run their own herds. Kane had achieved and surpassed the goals he had set for himself as a young man working other men's cattle. He owned substantial land now, enough to support a herd of over 1,000 head. He had built not just a house but a home, filled with children and laughter and music. He had earned the respect of his neighbors and competitors alike, known as a man whose word was good and whose cattle were well tended. But more than any business success, what filled Kane with deepest satisfaction was coming home each evening to Faye. They had grown together over the years, learning each other's rhythms and moods, developing the kind of comfortable intimacy that came from sharing a life in all its messy reality. They still talked for hours, sometimes sitting on the porch after the children were asleep, discussing everything from local politics to philosophical questions about the meaning of life. They still sang together too, with Faye teaching the children songs and Kane joining in with his rough but enthusiastic voice. When Jamie turned 15, he began riding out with Kane on cattle drives, learning the business from the ground up just as Kane had learned it. Rose discovered she had not just her mother's voice, but a talent for composition, writing songs that Faye would sing to the delight of their growing community. The twins were wild and rambunctious, always into some kind of mischief, but smart and kind-hearted underneath their rough exteriors. One summer evening when they had been married nearly 12 years, Kane and Faye took a rare evening alone, leaving the children in the care of Pete's wife Sarah, who had become like a grandmother to them. They rode to their valley, dismounting to walk along the creek as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. "You remember the first time we came here?" Faye asked, linking her arm through Kane's. "How could I forget? You were sitting on that boulder, singing like an angel, and my cattle were standing around you like you were some kind of prophet. I thought I had lost my mind, that the sun had finally gotten to me and I was hallucinating." Faye laughed. "I heard someone walking through the brush and was convinced I was about to be robbed or worse. Then you appeared, looking rough and dangerous, and I was trying to decide whether to run or stay." "What made you stay?" "Your voice," Faye said simply. "When you called out that you meant no harm, I heard the honesty in it. And then when you came closer, I saw your eyes. They were kind, even though everything else about you looked hard and weathered." Kane pulled her close, marveling as he always did at how perfectly she fit against him. "You changed my life that evening. I had no idea when I crested that rise and saw you singing that I was looking at my future wife, the mother of my children, the person who would make every day worth living. Nor did I realize I was looking at my future husband when I saw a trail-worn cowboy standing there with his mouth hanging open," Faye teased. But then her expression turned serious. "Kane, I want you to know something. My life before I met you, it was small and constrained and full of grief. You gave me room to grow, to become more than I ever thought I could be. You trusted me with your dreams and your vulnerabilities. You made me a partner, not just a wife. That is a gift I can never fully repay." "You repay it every single day," Kane said. "Every time I come home to a house full of warmth and laughter. Every time I see you teaching our children not just lessons from books, but lessons about kindness and integrity. Every time you sing and remind me that there is beauty in this world beyond just survival and work. You are everything, Faye. Everything I needed without knowing I needed it." They stood together as the sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, the same colors Kane remembered from that first evening. The valley had not changed much in 12 years, the creek still flowing over the same rocks, the grass still green where the water nurtured it. But everything else had changed, transformed by the decision two strangers had made to trust each other, to take a chance on the impossible idea that a few hours of conversation could reveal something profound and lasting. As the stars began to appear overhead, Faye sang softly, not the hymns and folk songs she usually favored, but something new, something she had been working on. It was a song about two souls finding each other in unexpected places, about building a life from nothing but hope and hard work, about love that grew deeper with each passing year. Kane listened with tears running down his weathered face, understanding that she had written this for him, for them, a musical expression of everything they had become to each other. When she finished, Kane said, "That is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." "I call it the Cowboy and the Singer," Faye said. "I have been working on it for months, trying to capture what this life feels like. Not just the happiness, but all of it. The struggles and the fears and the moments of doubt, and how love carries us through all of that." "It is perfect," Kane said, "just like you." "I am far from perfect," Faye said, laughing. "I burn dinner half the time, I lose my temper with the children, I get lonely when you are away on the long drives." "Perfect for me then," Kane amended. "Perfect for this life we have built." They stayed in the valley until the moon rose, reluctant to break the spell of this evening that felt like a renewal of vows, a recommitment to the promises they had made 12 years earlier under the oak tree in the Graham yard. Finally, they mounted their horses and rode home, arriving to find all 4 children still awake despite Sarah's best efforts, clamoring to hear about where their parents had been and what they had done. The years continued their steady march. Jamie grew into a man, taking on more and more responsibility for the cattle operation. At 21, he married a rancher's daughter from near Bishop, a strong-willed young woman named Catherine, who fit into the family as if she had always belonged there. They built their own house on Kane's land, and within a year presented Kane and Faye with their first grandchild, a girl named Faye after her grandmother. Rose went to San Francisco to study music, something Faye insisted on despite the expense. She returned 2 years later, not to ranch life but to a position teaching music at a school in Carson City. She visited often, bringing new songs and stories of city life that fascinated and slightly horrified her brothers. David and Samuel, inseparable as always, announced their intention to start a freight business, using the connections Kane had made over the years to transport goods between mining towns. Kane helped them buy their first wagons and teams, proud of their entrepreneurial spirit even as he missed having them around the ranch. Kane himself began to slow down as he entered his 50s, letting Jamie handle more of the day-to-day operation of the ranch. He still rode out to check the cattle most days, still made some of the drives to market, but he was content to take a less active role. Faye continued teaching, now instructing a second generation of ranchers' children, many of them the sons and daughters of the students she had taught when she first started. They had become pillars of their community, the couple everyone knew and respected. Their house was always open, always welcoming, whether to neighbors who needed help or travelers passing through looking for a meal and a safe place to sleep. Faye's singing was legendary now, and she was often called upon to perform at weddings and funerals and community celebrations. Kane served on various councils and committees, helping to shape the development of the region as it slowly transformed from wild frontier to settled ranch country. On their 25th anniversary, Jamie and Catherine organized a celebration that brought together everyone Kane and Faye had touched over the years. The Grahams came, now elderly but still sharp and full of life. Pete and Sarah were there, Pete now fully retired and living off savings and the pension Kane had insisted on setting up for him. Neighbors from 50 miles around attended, along with business associates and former students, and all 4 of Kane and Faye's children with their own growing families. As the sun set on that celebration, with the yard full of music and laughter and the smell of roasting meat, Kane pulled Faye aside to the place that had become their private sanctuary. a bench he had built on a rise overlooking the valley where they had met. 25 years, Kane said, shaking his head in wonder. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I found you singing to my nervous herd. Other times it feels like we have been together forever, like I cannot remember a time when you were not the center of my life. I know exactly what you mean, Faye said, leaning against his shoulder. When I look back at the young woman I was, traveling west with no clear plan beyond escaping a life I did not want, I barely recognize her. You helped me become someone I did not know I could be. You gave me purpose and partnership, and a love deeper than anything I imagined in my girlish dreams. Kane took both her hands in his, noting the lines and calluses that marked years of hard work, so different from the smooth hands she had possessed when they met. Faye Irwin, you are the best decision I ever made. You and our children and this life we have built, it is more than I ever dared hope for when I was young and alone and just trying to survive. And you, Kane Irwin, are the answer to questions I did not even know I was asking. I came west looking for escape, but I found home. I found you. They sat together as they had so many times over the years, watching the sun paint the sky in familiar shades of gold and rose. From the house below came the sounds of their family, their legacy. Children and grandchildren, friends and neighbors, all the lives they had touched simply by choosing each other on a twilight evening in a valley full of nervous cattle and unexpected possibility. Faye began to sing, softly, the song she had written years ago about the cowboy and the singer. Kane listened as he had listened that very first evening, captivated by her voice, grateful for every twist of fate that had brought them to this moment. When she finished, he kissed her with the same tenderness and passion that had marked their marriage from its improbable beginning. "Will you sing for me always?" Kane asked. "Always," Faye promised. "Until the sun goes down on our last day together, and then beyond that, in whatever comes next." As the stars emerged overhead and the celebration continued below them, Kane and Faye sat wrapped in each other's arms. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from that chance encounter. The cattle that had brought them together were long gone, replaced by other herds, other concerns. But the love that had sparked to life in a single evening had only grown stronger and deeper, proving that sometimes the most unexpected meetings lead to the most extraordinary lives. The years that followed were gentle ones, full of the quiet satisfactions that come with a life well lived. Kane and Faye watched their grandchildren grow, passed along the stories and songs and lessons they had learned over decades together. They took slow rides through the valley that had brought them together, and Faye sang in her still beautiful voice, while Kane listened with the same captivated attention he had shown as a rough young cowboy, who did not yet know his life was about to change. When Kane was 63 and Faye 60, they sat together one evening on their porch, watching the sun set over mountains they knew as intimately as they knew each other. Their children and grandchildren were scattered now, living their own lives, but the house was still full of love and memory. "No regrets?" Kane asked, as he had asked so many times over the years. "Not a single one," Faye replied, as she always did. "You. Only that I did not find you sooner," Kane said. "But then again, maybe we needed to be exactly who we were in exactly that place and time for this to work the way it did." "I think you are right," Faye agreed. "Everything happened exactly as it needed to. The storm that spooked your cattle, my walk to the creek that evening, your decision to stop and listen instead of just driving your herd onward. All of it led us here to this life to each other." As the sun touched the horizon, Faye began to sing one final time, her voice a bit thinner now but no less beautiful. She sang of green pastures and still waters, The same hymn she had been singing the first evening. Kane heard her voice drifting across the twilight prairie. Kane listened, holding her hand, feeling the weight and gift of all the years they had shared, all the love they had built together from nothing more than a song and a sunset, and the courage to trust in something neither of them fully understood. And when the sun went down that evening, as it had gone down on that first fateful meeting 32 years earlier, Kane and Faye Irwin sat together in the gathering darkness, still holding hands, still listening to the music that had brought them together and sustained them through everything that followed. They had found each other in the most improbable of circumstances, and they had made good on the promise of that finding, building a life and a love that would echo through generations, a testament to the extraordinary possibilities that exist when two souls recognize each other and have the courage to say yes to whatever comes next. Their story became the stuff of family legend, told and retold by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who came after. The tale of how a nervous herd led a cowboy to a woman singing by a creek, and how he listened until the sun went down, and how from that simple beginning came everything that mattered: love, family, purpose, home. It was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that the most important moments in life often arrive unexpectedly, dressed in ordinary clothes, asking only that we pay attention and have the courage to follow where they lead. And so their days continued in peace and contentment until age finally slowed them both down to stillness. First Kane at 72, and then Faye just 6 months later, as if she could not bear to be apart from him even for a moment longer than necessary. They were buried side by side on the rise overlooking the valley where they had met, and at the funeral, Rose sang the song her mother had written all those years ago about the cowboy and the singer, bringing tears to the eyes of everyone who had known them and understood what they had meant to each other. Their legacy lived on in the ranch that Jamie continued to run, in the songs Rose taught to new generations, in the freight business David and Samuel had built into a regional empire. But more than any material success, their true legacy was the model they had provided of what love could be when built on respect, partnership, honesty, and the willingness to choose each other every single day despite the hardships and challenges that inevitably came. In the end, it had all begun with a song and a sunset in a California valley in the summer of 1878, when a woman sang to calm a nervous herd and a cowboy listened until the sun went down. And something profound and lasting was born from that moment of unexpected connection. They had been strangers who became lovers, lovers who became partners, partners who became legends in their own small corner of the world. And if you visited that valley now, when the wind blew just right across the creek and the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, some people swore they could still hear her singing and imagine him listening. Two souls forever intertwined by the music that had brought them together and the love that had sustained them through all the days of their shared life.